About once a year, a game is due to release with an overflowing amount of hype, and sometimes those games live up to that hype, and sometimes they don't. Dragon's Dogma 2, I believe, is that game for this year, and today I wanted to compare Dragon's Dogma 2 to Elden Ring and put these open world action RPGs into the boxing ring to see who comes out on top. We're going to compare 5 critical elements as we always do with these video game verses, and each category I'll pick a winner, we'll see who wins at the end, but I'd love to know your winner down in the comments below. Now we'll start with technical design, and if you watch these video game verses, please come up with a better name for this section for me. So this encompasses your graphics, your performance, and your bugs. Now, we'll start with Elden Ring. So Elden Ring, and FromSoft games in general, often aren't the best looking games that come out in their release year, but the art direction is what really makes them stand out. They have a way of creating a dense environment and leveraging techniques like the mist is one thing that really stands out in Elden Ring, like how you can see over those landscapes, you can see the mist. Like underneath those mist, those assets are actually pretty low quality, but the mist is what really adds to that, and that's that sort of that element to the stunning environments that you see in Elden Ring, like always looking over and seeing those vistas. And you know, at launch and even today really, the performance in Elden Ring isn't really great. Like on PC at launch they had all those weird stuttering issues with shader compilation. That's still there, by the way. Like I actually get a couple of those stutters still today whenever I boot up the game, funnily enough. But with the addition of ray tracing, which seems like a weird thing for a game like Elden Ring, it actually does add a little bit to the world and to the way that the tree like really reflects its light across the world, and especially like when you're in tunnels and caves and you can see sort of, you know, a lot of the lighting from your lantern and the different lighting sources that come. There is definitely something that adds to that overall experience. And I wanted to touch on the ray tracing addition because Dragon's Dogma 2 decided to make the decision to essentially force players to play the game with ray tracing on console. They did release a patch very quickly that you can now turn it off, but you sort of don't want to turn it off because it does add just so much to the experience of Dragon's Dogma 2. Now, the classic sort of medieval aesthetic that it's going for isn't something that you see often in games. Like typically they try to fancify it, right? Like we see a lot of those medieval fantasy sort of games, but Dragon's Dogma 2 is a bit more of a realistic take on that medieval world. We're still obviously the fantasy elements, but not necessarily in its actual design of the world. But really like that ray tracing element just adds so much to Dragon's Dogma 2, not only in the darkness of the night to make those times feel more threatening with the new enemies that come out at night, but just the way that those light sources can reflect in the world. I think that the ray tracing decision here was absolutely the right decision, and the world feels like it was designed to have ray tracing enabled. And I hope we see more games do that and designing around that rather than, you know, without it and then adding it on top, similar to what Elden Ring has done. But the downside to that is obviously the just awful performance. Like PS5, even the first patch didn't really address it. Like the performance here is just atrocious. Like I made the decision to play Dragon's Dogma 2 on PS5, and I wish I didn't. I wish I did play it on PC like I played Elden Ring in most games. But you know, the downside here is even on PC as well, the performance here is all over the place because of these NPCs and the pathing and all the AI stuff that they've apparently put into that. But the weird thing is that like 50% of these NPCs don't really do anything, so I don't know why they didn't just remove them in the first place and fix some of those issues. But anyway, regardless, both of these titles released with very few legitimate bugs in the overall experience. Like I think there is a bit more jank, you could say, in Dragon's Dogma 2 because of some of the physics stuff they're doing there, but that's sort of warranted when you're doing such a complex physics system and on the larger enemies that you do fight as well. Like there's an element to that, like freedom of the structure there that does cause a little bit of jank here, but I think that's part of Dragon's Dogma 2's charm. In terms of a winner for this category, it's kind of tough, right? Like in a vacuum, I think the look of Dragon's Dogma 2 is significantly better, but then you talk about some of those performance issues, which are definitely worse in Dragon's Dogma 2, even though Elden Ring did have bad performance at launch as well. Like, you know, I think it might be recency biased, but I'm going to give this category to Dragon's Dogma 2. I really, really do love the aesthetic look of the game here, and despite the performance issues, I think it wins this category. So we'll give category 1 to Dragon's Dogma 2. Story. Let's start with Dragon's Dogma 2 here. Now, my initial notes for this have lol what story under Dragon's Dogma 2, but there is a story here. It's just presented in a weird way. Now, there is this concept in storytelling as like a fragmented story where you tell sections or, pieces of a story out of order or in smaller segments that really make up into a grander story. And we'll talk about that a little bit more with Elden Ring. And I think that in some degree, Dragon's Dogma 2 goes for this a little bit in that you sort of start in the middle of the narrative as you're already the Arisen and you're learning about that inciting incident, which really kicks off the story, which is as the, just as a general soldier, the dragon takes your heart, and then that kicks off the narrative as an Arisen, allows you to control the pawns, and the general narrative here is to, take your heart back and fight the dragon and everything else you do in between. The downside here, though, is that because you are starting in that sort of middle of the story here, like that initial kickoff and the inciting incident in Melve has already occurred, I really felt there's a bit of a disconnect with the dragon, as you don't interact with it directly only in that flashback sequence until basically like the end of the game. And then outside of that, the other stories that are told in the world feel vastly incomplete. Like the moment you arrive in Vernworth and you learn about the false Arisen, you never really interact with that false Arisen or the queen behind that plot in any real meaningful way or essentially at all. And then you get kicked off to go into Batal, and then whoops, the story is over and you're now essentially done. But there's just a feeling of disconnect, I think, across the board with Dragon's Dogma 2 and its storytelling. Like basically every character you run across outside of, the core cast in Vernworth call you the Arisen. So everyone knows that you are the Arisen, except somehow there is a false Arisen on the throne, and that's not really ever addressed in a meaningful way. And Back Batal, and then especially the volcanic island, feel woefully underdeveloped in terms of its story and NPCs. A good example of this, right, is on the game's box art. Queen Nadinia, the girl on the left. How can you really remember any times that you really interact with her in a meaningful way other than like one side quest that she doesn't really do anything in? And she's on the cover of the box art. Like Ulrika, the other figure on the box art, definitely gets a bit more story here, and there is actually a really meaningful and complete narrative with Melve, and that feels to me like the only actual complete story that I found in Dragon's Dogma 2. And it does feel a little disappointing, and like there was so much potential here with all of these NPCs and characters that all have really cool looks and feel like there should be so much more to them. Like there's plenty of characters I could just name off that, like, oh, I really want to learn more about them, but you just don't, and it's really disappointing, I think. Conversely, with Elden Ring, that fragmented storytelling that we're talking about here is really the centerpiece for all of From Software's storytelling, in that they don't tell you a real narrative. You are kicked off as an individual, and in this case, you're the Tarnished, as you're returning to the Lands Between to become Elden Lord after the shattering of the Elden Ring. Now, all the characters that you meet and the demigods you fight and everything else you fight, they all have very deep lore and interactions and relationships with the other demigods and the individuals in the world. And you only really learn about that through fragments of storytelling, with either talking to those demigods themselves in their boss fights and encounters, or the NPCs surrounding them is where you get those pieces of information. And one of my favorite things to do with Elden Ring and FromSoft games in general is to go watch lore YouTube videos. But the lore here is dense, and there's so much detail that you can pull out of it if you choose to, right? Like I think that's what's really unique about this experience, is that there is so much connection between the characters you are fighting and their relationship with the world, the Elden Ring, the runes, the Shattering, Marika and Radagon, and their way of expressing that to you is very vague. But if you can read between the lines, and if you delve deeper, and if you read the item descriptions, you can piece out that information together if you choose to. Whereas if you don't want to do that, you just want to focus on the other elements of Elden Ring, the game doesn't force that narrative section down your throat. It's only really there if you choose to engage with it, and I really like that way that FromSoft do that in their storytelling. So here I think the victor is pretty clear. It's definitely Elden Ring, considering that Dragon's Dogma 2 storytelling and story, its NPCs, narrative, everything feels just a little underbaked, and like there is a lot that was cut here. And I really hope that, a couple of years down the line, we get a lot of this stuff added to the game. Whereas Elden Ring at launch definitely felt like a complete narrative through and through. Combat is our next category, and we'll start with Elden Ring. Now, Elden Ring's combat has a very similar mechanics and systems and setup to Dark Souls, as that's clearly where they've pulled a lot of its animations and enemy structure from. For despite the enemy diversity and variety in Elden Ring, which is absolutely insane, by the way. Like, just we'll talk about the world design a little bit in that section once we get there. But the amount of enemy types in Elden Ring across its landscapes that are unique to those areas that really add to the theme of those locations is like incredible, the amount that they pulled off. And they all have unique animations and sounds, and even though they've pulled obviously a lot from Dark Souls, its enemies and its animations, there is absolutely something that makes each location feel new and fresh and have a new element of challenge when you get to them because of that enemy variety. So while the combat structure here is very similar to a Dark Souls, what really stands out in FromSoft's combat is not necessarily, to me personally, the difficulty that comes from it. It's the way that you can express yourself in those combat encounters via the different weapons and builds, etc., and the way that you choose to tackle those encounters and learn from them. Often enemies will use sort of weaker or smaller versions of attacks that the larger enemies or the enemies at the end of certain locations will use again to sort of reinforce that mechanic and learning those different animations. And that sense of progression of yourself and learning the combat in the game is part of what makes these FromSoft games unique in that way. And the addition of Torrent and being able to use mounted combat as well definitely makes these open landscapes feel so much fresher. Obviously the movement is easier as well, but being able to take these encounters in a completely different way, right? In some encounters in the open world, you could just jump off the horse, fight them, mano a mano, and in some encounters you can run sort of a hit and run tactic on Torrent, which allows you to tackle these scenarios in vastly different ways, not only in terms of the weapons you use, but whether you're mounted or not. Conversely, Dragon's Dogma 2 also does some interesting things. They have a lot of those Souls-like elements actually from, similar to an Elden Ring, right? With the maximum health declining over time from those different encounters and having to rest to regain that for both you and your pawns. The absolute best feature to Dragon's Dogma, in my opinion, is the combat. But really, it's the physics system that runs concurrently with it. It's really interesting that few games do this, obviously because it's quite difficult to pull off. But I would love a true Souls-like game that did this sort of physics system. And that really boils down to not only just, how you can climb enemies and find their weak spots and everything, but it's the way that these creatures, the larger enemies, interact with the environment. Like, the simplest answer is, knocking over an ogre and having it hit its head, and, it takes off some of that health, and the way that you can stagger the enemies and they interact with the world around them. It immerses you more into the experience of the game. And then the combat on top of that with the pawns as well. The AI is surprisingly good here. Like, they will actually, use the knowledge they have gained to fight enemies certain ways. And if they know how to deal with weak points, they will actually do that, or certain ways that they can fight enemies. I love how that the pawns seem to learn with you as you go through the experience and try new things. And that really adds to that immersive, deep experience of the combat loop in Dragon's Dogma 2. The big criticism here, though, is definitely that enemy variety, and it is severely lacking in Dragon's Dogma 2. So there is definitely new enemies that you experience once you leave Vernworth and go to Batal and beyond, but the downside here is that they are essentially exactly the same. There isn't really a fundamental difference between a goblin and a knacker other than a slight difference in the look, or the 3 or 4 different types of harpies. They are all essentially the same, even if they look slightly different. Now, what makes that enemy variety feel lacking is that just because they look slightly different doesn't mean that it feels like a new fight. Like, you can have enemies look completely the same, but if they have different animations and you have to tackle those scenarios differently, it makes you think about things in a new way. Whereas in Dragon's Dogma 2, it feels exactly the same, right? Between bandits, goblins, and knackers, they're all essentially the same fight. All the 4 different types of harpies, they're the same fight. The slightly different ogres or minotaurs or anything that you find throughout these different regions. Once you have a strategy that works, you'll continue to use that strategy, and the game doesn't stop you from doing that or make you think about things in a different way by adding new animations or new mechanics to any of those enemies, as they all operate essentially the same. And that leads to eventually the combat feeling stale, especially because of the density of you fighting those same enemies over and over again, where it loses some of that real touch that it has in those first 20 hours or so, when you're not really experiencing the combat system and you're still learning that really makes the combat system sing, and it loses that uniqueness to it. Whereas over the experience of Elden Ring, because you're constantly fighting new enemies, learning new mechanics, and tackling things in new ways, that experience in the combat continually feels fresh. Whereas over time in Dragon's Dogma, it does eventually get stale. I do really love the physics system and the way the pawns are used and how you can have synergies between them. But ultimately, I think it is that enemy variety and that feeling of the combat eventually getting stale is why I think Elden Ring wins this category, because it constantly challenges you to do things differently. Whereas you definitely reach a point in Dragon's Dogma, regardless of the vocation you are using, where most of the time your strategy and the way you implement it is going to be the same across the board, and you don't need to change that up as you fight the same enemies throughout most of the entire experience. World design is next. We're going to start with Elden Ring. Elden Ring's world design is unparalleled in my opinion for a couple of reasons. Now, one thing that I love in video games, especially open world games, is step out moments. Those moments when you walk through a door, the world is revealed to you and you can see just all these really interesting details. You can essentially stand there for a couple of minutes and just look at multiple different points of interest that in your mind, you're like, I want to go there, I want to go there, I want to go there. Elden Ring has multiple of these step out moments. Anytime you get to almost like a checkpoint in your journey, you reach these locations, you have so many of these moments where it's showing you that there is more to this world, enticing you to go further, to explore more and see what secrets you can find. And it rewards you for that exploration, not only in finding caves and catacombs and secrets as you explore every corner of the world, but in peeling back the layers and showing you how connected these locations are. As often you'll enter a cave and you'll come out at a new place and you'll realize that you're, essentially back to where you were, or you find those, hidden ladders you can knock down that take you back to previous sites of grace. And the way that the world is connected and the freedom in how you can explore it is why I can't get enough of the world. Dragon's Dogma 2 has some of those similar elements, right? Now you have a lot of these caves and interconnected locations where you can explore, and the freedom in that exploration, especially once you're using Mage's Levitate to be able to access some of these higher locations. And there is secrets to find. There's chests and hidden things in these locations and caves, and you can delve as deep into the exploration as you like. What is severely missing are those step out moments. There isn't really one. You get a nice moment at the very beginning of the game on the Griffin, but there isn't really one when you reach Batal or the volcanic island. It's lacking some of that majestic grandeur of enticing you to explore the world. And I think what makes some of that feel a little stale as well is how underutilized some of these locations are. Now, you can, off your own accord, explore anywhere you like, right? You can go to all of these locations and see what you can find. But in some aspects, it feels disappointing to spend that time to explore all the way into the Misty Woods or wherever you're going and just find a chest that doesn't have anything of value to you in there, or find weapons and armor that you already have better pieces of, or just not find anything that's meaningful, right? Finding bosses that you've already beaten, ogres, minotaurs, griffins, etc. I think they really struggle to reward you in a meaningful way for that exploration, right? There are things to find out there in the world, don't get me wrong, and you can get those seeker tokens and everything like that, but I think that there's just an element that's missing out there in the world. And I think the Seeker tokens was a bit of a band-aid fix to that by having them littered literally everywhere to sort of have you try and seek them out. But I would just like a little bit more carrot on the end of my stick to push me to explore all of these nooks and crannies. And I think that also plays into the enemy variety and the density here. And sometimes it feels very oppressive to explore, especially in Batal. I found exploring Batal to be almost tedious because there is just knackers and harpies and stuff everywhere. And sometimes I have multiple gameplay clips where I've run into a pack of knackers and then there's a golem here, and then okay, a griffin's landed, and then you're fighting 25 different things. And sometimes it feels almost oppressive in the amount of enemy encounters that you come across. And I also want to touch on a little bit the quote from Itsune, the game director, about travel is boring. That's not true. It's only issue because your game is boring. All you have to do is make travel fun. fun, really referring to the fast travel aspect, which Dragon's Dogma 2 does have fast travel, so it was clearly marketing speak, which is fine. You've got to market your game, like that's, everyone does that. But the thing that I think is interesting here is referring to traveling around the world, making it not boring. You don't really, just to me personally, you don't make it not boring by having the same pack of goblins every 2 meters and like making the enemy density just so strong that you can't breathe. I think having those moments of levity in something like an Elden Ring where, you're just listening to the backing tracks and you're just exploring on torrent or on foot and not fighting anything, just enjoying the world around you, is what makes travel interesting to me. Very similar to a Red Dead Redemption, in my opinion, in that those quieter moments are what really makes the world stand out, because you can enjoy the world around you rather than having a goblin jump on you every 5 seconds, like breaking up that experience, right? You've created a beautiful world in Dragon's Dogma 2. Like, we touched on how incredible it looks already. The game needs to let me enjoy that exploration without dumping enemies on me every 2 seconds. So this category, again, I think unfortunately goes to Elden Ring. Not only in the diversity of its landscapes, its step out moments, the way that it entices you to explore. There is definitely good elements to Dragon's Dogma 2 here as well, but I think Elden Ring does take the cake here again. So we've done 4 categories. Let's have a recap here. We've got Dragon's Dogma on 1 and Elden Ring on 3. So I don't think there's going to be any real complexity in the winner here, but we're going to do progression anyway as our final category. So this is always my favorite thing to talk about, because open world games and RPGs, and the best of them, give you a sense of progression throughout the experience. You are on an adventure, and that really comes from the progression, whether that be in terms of storytelling and character development, in terms of leveling up, gaining new skills, etc. But that is part of a core experience in an open world game, and you need to get this right to keep pushing you throughout the experience. So with Elden Ring, now this is a typical Souls-like experience in that you'll kill enemies, you'll get runes, you'll use those runes to level up yourself and your weapons and armor that you come across. Across a pretty much 100-hour game, Elden Ring does an incredible job of giving you a sense of progression across that entire journey. Now, you'll obviously level yourself up across the whole experience, but you will constantly find new and interesting weapons, spells, and incantations to tinker with, and then that leads to a build expression that is so fun and unique. And one of Elden Ring's best features in that you can make builds and have themed armor around them and a look and a feel to them that are entirely unique and feel like you compared to someone else. And the diversity across the weapons here is what makes that really sing, right? You've got people that just lean on those massive, big, heavy strength weapons, or people that prefer, tiny little daggers or using spells or incantations. You can find something that connects with you, and throughout the entire journey, you are constantly feeling like you're finding new things for your specific build time that you can experience and play around with. Conversely, in Dragon's Dogma 2, you level up in a very traditional RPG way, either by doing quests or defeating enemies. Both you and your main pawn will level up in that way, gaining strength and magicka stats. Now, there is also DCP, which will level up your vocations, which all have up to 10 ranks. Each rank will unlock new weapon skills or core skills or augments. There is definitely a solid sense of progression here as you are leveling yourself up, though the self levels of both you and your main pawn feel lacking because there's no real engagement from the player here. You just see a pop-up that says you leveled up, you gain some stats, whoop-de-doo. You don't really do anything or engage in that in a meaningful way. What you do engage in is the DCP, being the vocations, and actually leveling them up to pick new skills, whether that be weapon skills or core skills or augments, and the way that you can decide which of those 4 you are going to use, and then also the augments that you're going to use on top of that. One thing that I think is a limiting in terms of the structure of leveling up the vocations and choosing which we're going to use is that only having 4 skills leads you to a development problem in that you can't have a wealth of skills for each vocation to choose from, so you've only got to have a couple of them that are actually quite good, which in turn leads to a lack of some of that build expression, because in most vocations there is really only 1 or 2 or 3 skills that are actually really good that you have to use for any build. So you do have some of that expression and variety and skill usage with the warfare being because you can have any of the weapon skills, but there isn't enough expression inside those vocations to make something something that feels entirely unique to you in terms of your build diversity. Where I think that actually comes from in Dragon's Dogma 2 is how you choose to build your party. It's more about building a party of 4 and the way that they synergize together rather than your individual build of your vocation, because a lot of the vocations will have very similar setups. It's how you synergize them together and the ways that you as a party will tackle these situations together as a group. The equipment progression is a little lacking in Dragon's Dogma 2, unfortunately, though. So most equipment for all the vocations is either a direct upgrade or it's simply not. It's pretty linear across the experience, right? It's not necessarily, choosing between 3 to 4 different weapons, and each has their own strengths or weaknesses. For the most part here, every weapon you find for each vocation will either be better at its, main stat being strength or magic, or it'll just be worse and you won't worry about it. There is some freedom there in terms of some weapons that have imbues on them already, but for the most part, those weapons are still fitting in that linear progression system that they have put up with a lot of the equipment, which is a little disappointing. I would like more expression in what weapons I use, right? You've obviously got those weapons that have those unique imbues, but why can't there be more of a choice in the weapons I want to use? For example, with fighters and warriors, they have slash and strike weapons, swords and maces or hammers. Why can't there be a choice between, there essentially being a weapon that's identical stat-wise for both, and I can choose whether I want to use strength or slash, or maybe there's another one that has, a fire imbue, which one do I want to use? And then you've also got vocations that just don't have any of that freedom, right? Like thieves only use daggers and archers only use just basic bows. There's no real depth in terms of that weapon variety for each of the vocations, unless you're playing the Warfarer. But I think this category goes to Elden Ring again. I do feel a little bit like I am shitting on Dragon's Dogma 2 a little bit. Now, I just want to get it across the board here that I do actually like Dragon's Dogma 2. This video is comparing it to one of the greatest Souls-likes open world RPGs ever, right? Like it's definitely a tall task, and I hope I've done a good job of expressing what I like about Dragon's Dogma 2 here, but there is obviously a lot to like in Elden Ring as well. Now, Elden Ring and Dragon's Dogma 2 are both Japanese open world RPGs, and while there is clearly a lot of overlap in their design structure, Elden Ring feels like a complete game through and through. A game of its scope and size is something that's absolutely incredible and something we may never actually see again. Dragon's Dogma 2, to me, feels like they attempted a similar level of scope, not only in its giant landscape and its obtuse open-ended questing structure and its free form of player progression and exploration. There is really something disappointing to me that maybe given another year or two in the oven, Dragon's Dogma 2 could have reached similar heights to Elden Ring. The bones of a truly revolutionary RPG experience are there. It just didn't have enough meat to sustain its rabid ambition. But let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Who's your winner and why? I'd love to have an interesting discussion with you guys. Thank you for watching this video till the end. Thank you to our members for supporting the channel. You guys are the reason we do these longer videos. My name is NorZZa, and I hope you have a great day.